December 1944. The war was still raging in Europe, but across the ocean, inside the heart of the United States, snow dusted the roofs of barracks surrounded by barbed wire. Behind the fences sat thousands of men who had once fought fiercely under the swastika. German prisoners of war, captured in North Africa, in France, or at sea, now found themselves in places they had never imagined: Texas, Iowa, Minnesota. For many, Christmas was the loneliest time of all. They expected nothing. Perhaps another bowl of stew from the camp kitchens. Perhaps silence broken only by the crunch of guards' boots in the snow. The propaganda they had grown up on told them to expect cruelty, deprivation, even starvation in enemy hands. Few imagined kindness. And yet, on Christmas morning, packages began to arrive. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "On Christmas morning, we received gifts from our enemies. I could hardly believe my eyes." Inside the parcels were things they had not seen in years: bars of chocolate, small bags of hard candy, cigarettes carefully wrapped, tins of coffee, even socks and scarves knitted by American hands. Some came from the Red Cross, others from local churches and civic groups who had adopted the strange custom of sponsoring POWs during the holiday. Stockings hung in some barracks. In others, tiny pine trees, trimmed with bits of colored paper and scraps of wood, stood as reminders of home. The irony was unbearable for some. Their families back in Germany were facing hunger, shivering through blacked-out nights as bombs rained down, queuing for bread that often ran out. Letters from home told of shortages, cold, and despair. And yet here in enemy captivity, the prisoners found themselves eating chocolate, puffing American cigarettes, and warming their feet with wool socks sent by strangers. Gratitude was mixed with guilt. The scene inside the camps was surreal. Snow crunched under boots as men lined up for church services, singing hymns that drifted into the winter air. German voices lifted, still knacked, across the wire, while American guards leaned on their rifles and listened quietly. Some guards even hummed along, the melody familiar in both languages. Later, small feasts were shared in the mess halls. Simple meals of turkey, potatoes, and pie. Modest by American standards, but extraordinary to men who had expected only bitterness. The emotions were raw. Some prisoners wept openly, clutching their parcels, remembering children back home who would receive nothing that year. Others wrote letters describing their astonishment. "They treat us better here than our families are treated at home." For men hardened by years of fighting, the sudden warmth of generosity was almost disarming. For the Americans running the camps, the gesture carried purpose. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment, but many guards and local communities went further. Churches sent choirs to sing at the fences. Women's groups packed small parcels. Farmers invited POW work details to share a meal. It was not universal. Not every camp was generous, and not every American was sympathetic. But enough kindness shone through that German prisoners remembered it decades later as one of the strangest and most human moments of the war. And yet, not every man felt comfort. For some, the gift stirred anger. How could they enjoy candy while their children starved? How could they accept kindness from the enemy while their comrades died in frozen foxholes at the Ardennes? For those men, the gifts were reminders of their powerlessness, their defeat, and the bitter irony of being cared for by those they had once been told to hate. Still, as the snow fell that Christmas in 1944, the reality could not be denied. German soldiers, far from home, sat inside American barbed wire and unwrapped presents they never expected to see. It was a moment that revealed a deeper truth. Sometimes war is not only fought with weapons, but with small acts of humanity. And for these prisoners, astonished and conflicted, the question lingered. How had they even ended up here, in America's heartland, staring at gifts from strangers across the wire. 2 years earlier, the men who now sat behind American barbed wire had been fighting in deserts, on beaches, and across fields thousands of miles from home. Many had been part of Rommel's Afrika Korps, captured in North Africa as the tide of battle shifted in 1942-43. Others had surrendered in Italy or France, surrounded as Allied offensives pressed forward. Some came from U-boats, forced to the surface, and taken prisoner at sea. Their journeys into captivity were long, uncertain, and often terrifying. Prisoners marched under armed guard to ports, herded aboard troopships bound across the Atlantic. Below decks, the air was thick with sweat and diesel. Seasickness was constant, and the fear of Allied submarines haunted every crossing. Ironically, German sailors who had once hunted merchant ships now prayed that American or British destroyers would guard them safely across the ocean. For many, the first glimpse of America came through a porthole, the skyline of New York City rising out of the mist. The Statue of Liberty stood tall, a cruel irony to soldiers who arrived in chains. They craned their necks to see neon lights, billboards, cars buzzing along crowded streets. Some whispered to each other in disbelief, "This is the America we were told was starving? This is the land we were told was collapsing." The sheer scale of what they saw left them stunned. From New York, trains carried them deeper into the country. Guards watched silently as the prisoners stared out windows at landscapes they had never imagined. Rows of neat farmhouses, endless cornfields, sprawling towns with bright lights, even at night. For men raised in war-torn Europe, the abundance of food in roadside diners, the gleam of cars on highways, the casual life of American civilians was surreal. Their destinations were far from the coasts, deliberately chosen to prevent escape. Camps were built in the heartland, Texas plains, Iowa farmland, Minnesota forests. Barbed wire fences enclosed rows of barracks. Guard towers overlooked the compounds. Yet even here, many were surprised. The camps had kitchens, infirmaries, even recreation fields. They had expected brutality, but instead found order and structure. Still, the adjustment was harsh. For young men in their 20s, trained for battle, captivity felt like a wound deeper than any bullet. Letters home were censored, contact was scarce, and the distance to Germany felt immeasurable. Christmas, especially, carried the weight of absence. They imagined mothers at church services, siblings huddled in cold houses, families praying for sons who might never return. Inside the camps, that loneliness was magnified by the strangeness of America. And yet, despite the shock of defeat and the humiliation of capture, there was also relief. They were alive. For many, capture meant escape from endless combat. No more artillery screaming overhead. No more hunger and mud. Even if they were prisoners, they were safe. They slept in bunks instead of foxholes. They ate regular meals. And in time, they learned the rhythms of captivity. Work details, roll calls, long days punctuated by cigarettes and conversations. It was a strange limbo, suspended between the world they had left and the one that surrounded them. For months, life blurred into routine. Barbed wire kept them in, guards kept watch, and the war raged far away. But as December approached in 1944, something shifted. The monotony of camp life was broken by small signs of the season. Snow on the barracks roofs, prisoners humming old German carols, whispers of the holidays back home. None of them expected kindness. None of them imagined the Americans would acknowledge Christmas for men who had once fought to destroy them. But what happened next would upend those assumptions and leave memories that prisoners carried for the rest of their lives. A Kansas farmer leaned on his fence post one morning in 1944, watching in silence as a column of German prisoners marched past on their way to a nearby camp. The men wore mismatched uniforms, some patched, some frayed, their boots caked with mud from the long journey. They looked tired, but not dangerous. Just young men, many barely older than his own son who was fighting in Europe. Behind them, American guards walked with rifles slung casually over their shoulders, more like escorts than executioners. Scenes like this played out across the American heartland. More than 400,000 German prisoners were held in the United States during the war, scattered across hundreds of camps. The sight of the enemy marching past astonished locals. They expected hulking brutes, indoctrinated fanatics. Instead, they saw blonde, blue-eyed boys or farmhands who looked no different from their neighbors. Some townspeople were uneasy. Others felt curious, even sympathetic. Inside the camps, life followed a routine. Prisoners rose at dawn for roll call, lined up in neat formations while guards counted heads. They ate in mess halls, meals that often astonished them for their size and variety. Breakfast might include oatmeal, eggs, and bread with jam. Lunch and dinner brought stews, potatoes, or meat. For men raised on rationing and scarcity, the abundance was almost unsettling. One POW later admitted, "We ate better as prisoners than our families did at home." Work was part of daily life. Under the Geneva Conventions, POWs could be assigned labor not directly connected to the war. Many worked in agriculture, harvesting wheat, corn, and cotton. Farmers welcomed the extra hands as American manpower was overseas. Others worked in lumber camps, canneries, or even small factories. They were paid in camp scrip, not real dollars, but tokens they could spend in canteens on cigarettes, candy, or writing paper. For some, this was their first experience of earning wages outside the strict discipline of the army. Recreation filled the hours between duties. Soccer fields and makeshift theaters sprang up inside the wire. Prisoners played music on homemade instruments, staged plays, and even painted murals in barracks. Red Cross parcels brought books, and education programs were offered. Some men studied English, others mathematics or engineering. For young soldiers whose education had been cut short by war, captivity became an unexpected classroom. Still, captivity was not freedom. Barbed wire towers loomed over every yard, searchlights swept across at night, and escape attempts were harshly punished. Guards were firm, though often not cruel. Rules were enforced. But within the rules, prisoners discovered a surprising degree of humanity. They learned that the Americans were not the monsters they had been told about in Nazi propaganda. Some guards even exchanged small talk, cigarettes, or jokes. Life inside the camps created strange encounters between enemies. In rural communities, townsfolk sometimes hired POWs to help on farms. Children gawked at the Germans, who often smiled back. Families saw that the enemy spoke of their own families, their own Christmas memories, their longing for home. The war, at least for a moment, seemed distant behind the fences. But the most striking memories came during the winter months. Snow fell on the camps, coating barbed wire with frost. Prisoners carved small ornaments from scrap wood, folding paper stars, and humming carols from their childhood. They thought of churches back home, candlelit and warm, and the voices of families gathered together. Some men confessed later that this longing was the hardest part of captivity, not the work or the rules, but the absence of loved ones during the holidays. They expected those days to pass in silence, marked only by the ache of memory. Instead, what awaited them would shake their assumptions about captivity, America, and even the nature of the war itself. Because in December of 1944, Christmas behind barbed wire would come with surprises they never could have imagined. By December 1944, the barracks in America's POW camps had taken on a winter hush. Snow lay thick on the rooftops, and ice formed along the fences. Inside, German prisoners passed the long evenings carving small decorations from scraps of wood, folding stars out of newspaper, or humming the carols they had grown up with. For most, Christmas was a time of aching absence. They pictured their families back in Germany, mothers shivering in blacked-out basements, children clutching ration cards, churches without candles, towns shattered by bombs. In captivity, the season was supposed to feel colder still, a reminder that they were enemies on foreign soil. But then, something unexpected happened. The first hints came when Red Cross parcels arrived in December. Prisoners tore them open with disbelief. Inside were chocolate bars, cigarettes, tins of coffee, and small bags of candy. For men who had eaten little but bread and stew for months, it was as though luxury had fallen from the sky. Even more surprising were the packages that came from local churches and civic groups. Stockings stuffed with fruit, knitted socks, handkerchiefs, even small Bibles arrived at some camps. The senders were not anonymous bureaucrats, but ordinary Americans, women's auxiliaries, Sunday school children, families who had never met the men behind the wire. One prisoner recalled later, "I could not understand it. We were their enemies, yet they sent us gifts as if we were neighbors in need." Camp commanders often permitted special observances. In some camps, guards allowed prisoners to bring small pine trees into their barracks, decorating them with strings of paper chains or carved figures. In others, services were held in chapels or in open yards, where German chaplains led prayers under watchful American eyes. The sound of Still Nacht drifted into the cold night air, joined at times by Americans humming their own silent night. For men who had expected indifference or even cruelty, the gesture was overwhelming. Some prisoners admitted they cried openly. Others wrote long letters home, trying to capture the astonishment of receiving kindness in captivity. One letter smuggled back to Germany read, "Here, in the enemy's land, we celebrated Christmas with gifts. We were given more than our families will have." The irony weighed heavily. Back in Germany, Christmas meant scarcity, bombings, hunger. Families huddled in cellars, clutched bread rations, and tried to keep hope alive. Some prisoners felt guilt biting at the edges of their joy. How could they eat chocolate while their children starved? How could they unwrap gifts while their homes lay in ruins? But alongside the guilt came gratitude, and a dawning realization that the enemy they had been told to hate was capable of mercy. The guards themselves often reflected this spirit. Many were ordinary men, too old for frontline duty, who understood what Christmas meant. Some bent the rules, allowing prisoners to stay up later for caroling, slipping extra food onto plates, or even exchanging small greetings across the wire. In one camp, guards pooled money to buy extra tobacco for the prisoners' canteen. In another, they shared their own army rations of fruitcake and candy. The celebrations were simple, but they carried a power that transcended the barbed wire. A prisoner playing a handmade violin filled the barracks with music. Groups sang carols late into the night. Men exchanged small gifts they had made themselves, carved figurines, drawings, or carefully folded paper stars. Some decorated their bunks with pine branches, turning gray barracks into something faintly resembling home. Not every prisoner welcomed the generosity. For the die-hard loyalists among them, the kindness was almost unbearable. Accepting gifts from the enemy felt like betrayal. They muttered that such gestures were attempts to weaken their spirit, to make them forget their duty to the Reich. Yet even those men could not deny the warmth that filled the camp during those days. The holiday surprise revealed something profound. Behind the war, behind the uniforms and propaganda, human beings still recognized each other's need for comfort, ritual, and hope. Christmas had become a bridge across the wire. As the snow continued to fall and the barracks glowed faintly with handmade decorations. Many prisoners lay awake that night, reflecting on the strangeness of it all. They were captives far from home, surrounded by fences and guards. Yet they had unwrapped gifts, sung carols, and even tasted chocolate. In the darkest winter of the war, in a place they least expected, they had found a glimpse of light. And in the days that followed, that light lingered, carried not just in packages and stockings, but in the voices that rose together in song. On Christmas Eve, 1944, the cold pressed hard against the barracks walls of camps scattered across the American heartland. Snow glittered under the moonlight, crunching beneath the boots of guards pacing their towers. Inside the wire, German prisoners gathered quietly, some clutching hymn books, others relying on memory. As midnight approached, the first notes of Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht rose into the night. The sound startled some guards, who paused mid-step, listening. The prisoners' voices, soft at first, grew stronger, carrying across the frozen yard. Alice schlaft, einsam wacht. The words were familiar, even if the language was not. For many Americans, standing watch, the melody struck a chord deep in memory. A few guards, almost unconsciously, began humming their own version. Silent Night, Holy Night. And so, across the divide of barbed wire, two languages sang one song. The imagery was unforgettable. Frosted fences glistened, breath rose in plumes into the dark air, and the harmonies mingled into something hauntingly beautiful. For a brief moment, the war seemed to fall silent. Enemies shared not bullets, but a carol written in Austria more than a century earlier, a hymn of peace sung in the middle of humanity's most destructive conflict. Inside the barracks, some prisoners closed their eyes, imagining home, candlelit churches, children's voices, the smell of pine and baking bread. Others fought back tears, their voices breaking as they remembered families who would spend that Christmas in darkness under bombing raids. For them, the act of singing together was both a comfort and a wound. The guards, too, felt the moment's weight. Many were older men, veterans of the First World War, or too old for frontline service. They understood loss, separation, and the ache of family far away. Hearing the prisoners sing carols that matched their own traditions reminded them that the men behind the wire were not faceless enemies, but human beings, shaped by the same rituals of faith and season. In some camps, American chaplains organized joint services, reading from scripture as German chaplains translated for their fellow prisoners. Hymns echoed across languages. "O come, all ye faithful," was sung in English and German. Simple wooden crosses, or small Christmas trees, decorated the makeshift chapels. Guards attended, prisoners knelt, and for an hour, captivity and war faded into ritual. The symbolism was not lost on the men themselves. One POW later wrote, "That night, I realized for the first time that our enemies were also men of faith, men of families, men of the same God. It shook me. For others, the moment deepened guilt. How could they feel warmth from the enemy while their families froze in Germany? Yet even guilt could not erase the power of hearing familiar songs in a foreign land. Carols became a form of resistance to despair. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, prisoners practiced quietly, forming choirs that filled the evenings with music. Handmade instruments accompanied them. A violin cobbled together from scraps, harmonicas brought in Red Cross parcels. On Christmas Eve, the music spilled beyond the fences. In some camps, townsfolk nearby paused to listen, hearing the strange, beautiful blend of German voices carried on the wind. Not every prisoner sang. Some refused, embittered or defiant, unwilling to share in joy provided by the enemy's tolerance. But for many, the songs became an anchor. They reminded them of identity beyond soldiering, beyond ideology, identity rooted in shared culture and humanity. The mingling of voices left an impression on guards as well. Some later admitted that Christmas Eve softened their perception of the men they watched daily. They stopped seeing them only as Nazis or enemies, and began to notice them as young men who missed home just as deeply as they themselves did. When Christmas morning came, the echoes of the carols lingered. Gifts, meals, and parcels would fill the day, but it was the memory of those shared songs, one side in German, the other in English, yet singing the same melody, that stayed with many prisoners for life. For them, the music had crossed the wire more effectively than any letter or package. It had bridged the gap between enemy and enemy, reminding both sides that, even in war, a song could make the world feel whole for a fleeting moment. Snow crunched under heavy boots as a line of German prisoners trudged through a Kansas field, their breath forming clouds in the crisp December air. American guards followed at a distance, rifles slung over shoulders, but there was little tension. The prisoners were not marching to battle, they were walking to work. Across the United States, German POWs were put to labor under the Geneva Conventions. They could not be forced into dangerous or military-related jobs, but they were assigned tasks that filled America's labor shortages. With millions of American men overseas, farms and factories needed hands. So the prisoners found themselves harvesting wheat in Nebraska, chopping lumber in Minnesota, or picking cotton under the Texas sun. Winter brought new duties. In the Midwest, they shoveled snow, split firewood, and helped keep local infrastructure running. Farmers welcomed the help. Some even slipped the prisoners extra coffee or bread, grateful for their labor. For the men behind the wire, the work was tiring, but it carried something they had not expected: pay. Instead of dollars, they earned camp scrip, small paper notes redeemable only inside the camp canteens. With it, prisoners could buy soap, cigarettes, candy, stationery, or small comforts. Around Christmas time, the scrip took on new meaning. Men pooled their wages to buy extra rations or small gifts for each other. Some carved toys out of scrap, wood to exchange, while others purchased chocolate or tobacco to share on Christmas Eve. The contrast with Germany was heartbreaking. Back home, their families scrounged for food, queued for hours in front of bakeries, and watched their possessions vanish in bombings. Letters from wives and mothers spoke of hunger, of children with hollow cheeks, of holidays without meat or candles. In America, their sons and brothers, prisoners of war, earned wages, bought candy, and smoked cigarettes. The irony was almost unbearable. One prisoner later confessed, "I felt guilt every time I lit an American cigarette. My wife at home had none. My children had no milk. And yet I, a prisoner, was given money and gifts by our enemy." Despite the guilt, the small freedoms mattered. Men who had lived under strict military discipline discovered the dignity of choosing how to spend their wages. Some bought books and studied in camp classes. Others saved up for extra food. A few sent carefully crafted items home when allowed: small wooden carvings, toys, or painted postcards made with canteen supplies. The work itself also shifted perceptions. Prisoners who had been steeped in Nazi propaganda about decadent, weak Americans now saw ordinary farmers and townsfolk up close. They worked side by side, sweating in fields or hauling timber. They saw that America's strength was not just in its weapons, but in its abundance of food, machines, and manpower. Winter made the lessons sharper. While German civilians shivered in ruined homes, POWs were issued coats and gloves. They labored in snow but returned to warm barracks, hot meals, and sometimes even holiday feasts arranged by sympathetic guards. The security contrasted painfully with the chaos back home. Around Christmas, some farmers or townsfolk added small gestures: a cup of hot coffee after a day of chopping wood, a slice of pie slipped into a lunch bag. In one town, children waved at the prisoners as they worked in fields, shouting greetings across the fence line. These acts, though minor, chipped away at the image of America as a ruthless enemy. Still, not every moment was warm. Some guards remained distant, some townsfolk hostile. Not all camps were generous. Yet even in stricter conditions, the rhythm of work, wages, and small choices gave prisoners a sense of humanity they had expected to lose. For many, the Christmas season magnified the irony of their captivity. They were enemies, laboring for the nation that fought to destroy their homeland. Yet in the process, they found dignity, food, and even wages. They were supposed to be broken, but instead they discovered comfort. This tension, between guilt and gratitude, suspicion and kindness, would linger long after the snow melted. It would also prepare them for an even deeper reckoning, the collapse of propaganda itself, as the reality of life in America clashed with everything they had once believed. In Germany, the message had been clear. Capture meant misery. Nazi propaganda warned its soldiers that if they surrendered, the Allies would starve, beat, or even kill them. Posters showed caricatures of Americans as greedy, violent brutes. Radio broadcasts thundered that prisoners would be stripped of dignity, reduced to slaves, or worked to death. Better to die for the Reich, they were told, than to fall into enemy hands. And yet, in the quiet of American camps, reality told a different story. A German prisoner at a camp in Texas wrote home secretly, "We are treated better here than our families are treated at home." He described meals of meat, potatoes, vegetables, even desserts. He wrote of warm clothes, wages for labor, and most astonishingly, gifts at Christmas. "The Americans," he added, "have shown us a fairness we were told did not exist." The dissonance was jarring. Many prisoners struggled to reconcile what they saw with what they had believed. The abundance in American camps clashed sharply with memories of rationing in Germany. Letters from home spoke of air raids, hunger, and blackouts. Inside the wire, POWs ate chocolate, smoked American cigarettes, and sang carols without fear of bombs falling from the sky. Some prisoners embraced the new reality. They marveled at American abundance, at the freedom of guards who treated them like men rather than beasts. They studied English in camp classes, read American newspapers, and grew curious about democracy. For these men, captivity became a window into another world, one that shook their loyalty to Nazi ideology. Others resisted. The most ardent loyalists muttered that the kindness was a trick, a scheme to soften their spirit. They warned fellow prisoners not to be fooled by chocolate and gifts. They reminded them that Hitler demanded loyalty, that the Reich still fought on. In some camps, pro-Nazi factions tried to enforce discipline, intimidating those who showed too much interest in American ways. But even the most committed found it hard to ignore what they saw. Farmers with smiling children, guards who wished them a Merry Christmas, townsfolk who sent stockings or cookies. These were not the monsters of propaganda. They were ordinary people, and their kindness left a mark. For prisoners, the realization was unsettling. If their leaders had lied about America, what else had they lied about? The doubt crept in slowly, seated by each Red Cross parcel, each warm winter coat, each unexpected holiday gift. For some, the doubt would bloom into rejection of Nazi ideology after the war. For others, it remained a quiet memory, a recognition that the world was not as simple as the slogans on posters had once claimed. The emotional weight was heavy, gratitude mixed with guilt, relief clashed with confusion. A man could enjoy chocolate on Christmas morning, yet feel shame knowing his family had none. He could feel comfort under an American blanket, yet anger at the war that placed him in such irony. Still, by 1944 and 1945, the propaganda machine had lost its grip. Word spread from camp to camp that America was not the land of cruelty they had been told. Stories of gifts, songs, and kindness carried more weight than radio broadcasts from Berlin. The image of the enemy was changing, not completely, not universally, but undeniably. And nowhere was this clearer than in the personal connections that began to form, small acts of friendship exchanged across the barbed wire, often starting during Christmas itself. In the weeks around Christmas, something unusual happened in many American POW camps. The barbed wire still stood, the guards still patrolled, but small acts of kindness slipped quietly across the divide. In one camp, a local church group delivered a small evergreen tree, trimmed with paper ornaments made by children. Prisoners placed it in their barracks, standing in silence as the smell of pine filled the room, a reminder of home. In another, townsfolk baked cookies and left them at the gate to be distributed among men who had once been called their mortal enemies. The gifts were simple, but to the prisoners they felt extraordinary. The Germans reciprocated in ways they could, skilled with their hands. Some carved toys from scrap wood or folded paper into delicate stars. Others painted small watercolors or drew portraits for local families. One farmer remembered a POW handing his daughter a hand-carved doll at Christmas, the girl clutching it with delight. The irony was sharp. The enemy had made her first real toy during wartime scarcity. Music also became a bridge. Choirs of prisoners sang carols in the yard, and sometimes guards or even local townspeople gathered outside to listen. On rare occasions, Americans joined in. For a few moments, there was no wire, no war, just voices mingling in familiar hymns. Some friendships grew quietly in these spaces. Guards slipped prisoners extra cigarettes or wished them Merry Christmas. Farmers who relied on POW labor sometimes invited them for coffee or pie, bending the rules in small gestures of hospitality. These moments lingered in memory long after the war. The emotional impact was powerful. For German prisoners, the kindness created warmth, but also unease. How could they accept gifts from the enemy while their families at home starved and froze? Gratitude mixed with guilt, joy with sorrow. Some later admitted that these acts of generosity began to reshape their view of America. Others resisted, clinging to loyalty. But even they could not forget the taste of sugar cookies or the sound of children's laughter on Christmas Eve. The Americans, too, were changed. Townsfolk who had expected to see monsters discovered ordinary young men, many not so different from their own sons overseas. Guards who had braced for hostility found themselves exchanging smiles and greetings. A few even maintained correspondence with former prisoners after the war, bonds born in the unlikeliest of places. Not every camp was warm. Some remained strict, some hostile. And yet the stories of kindness, of cookies, trees, toys, and songs traveled far among the POWs. They became stories told again and again in later years, memories that softened the sharp edges of captivity. Christmas behind barbed wire was never home, but the small acts of friendship that crossed the fences showed both sides that humanity could survive even in wartime. And when the war finally ended, those memories became even sharper, because home was not the place many prisoners remembered. In 1946, long after the guns had fallen silent, the trains carrying German POWs finally began rolling east. For months, they had waited in American camps, wondering what home would look like when they returned. They packed their meager belongings, carvings, notebooks, letters, or souvenirs from their time in captivity. Some carried memories of Christmas gifts, the taste of chocolate, the sound of Silent Night, sung across barbed wire. Those memories gave them hope as they boarded the ships that would carry them back across the Atlantic. But when they stepped off the trains in Germany, hope collapsed into shock. Cities lay in ruins. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, once proud centers of culture and industry, were reduced to skeletons of stone and twisted steel. Streets were filled with rubble, trams stood frozen, and buildings gaped open like broken teeth. Smoke still rose in some quarters, months after the last bombs had fallen. The prisoners stared in disbelief. They had left behind America's abundance. Fields of wheat, tidy towns with bright lights, Christmas feasts, and returned to a land that looked like the moon. The emotional blow was crushing. Some rushed to find their families, only to discover homes flattened, loved ones dead, or relatives missing. Others were reunited, but the joy was tempered by hardship. Mothers with hollow faces, children in rags, and lines of civilians waiting for hours to receive a crust of bread. One former POW wrote bitterly, "At Christmas in America, we received chocolate from our enemies. At Christmas in Germany, my children had nothing but turnips." The contrast could not have been sharper. Behind American barbed wire, they had eaten well, sung carols, received gifts. In freedom, they found hunger, ruin, and despair. Many admitted with shame that life as a prisoner had been easier than life as a free man in post-war Germany. The irony haunted them. They remembered stockings hung in barracks, trees decorated with paper chains, parcels delivered by strangers. They remembered the warmth of guards wishing them well, the sound of music drifting through snowy nights. Now, back home, Christmas meant candle stubs, cold cellars, and empty tables. For some, the guilt was overwhelming. They had survived, even thrived in small ways, while their families suffered in silence. The psychological burden shaped how they remembered captivity. Some tried to bury the memories, feeling they had no right to speak of kindness from the enemy when their own people had endured misery. Others spoke openly, recalling with wonder how Americans had treated them humanely, even generously. A few even felt gratitude, confessing that those small gestures of humanity had planted seeds of reconciliation. Yet, the adjustment was never easy. Returning prisoners often found themselves distrusted or resented. Civilians who had endured bombings sneered at stories of warm meals and gifts behind American fences. "You had it better than us," some accused. And in many cases, it was true. The POWs carried guilt not only for defeat, but for comfort in captivity. Still, the memories persisted. Decades later, when asked about their time in America, many POWs returned to one image: Christmas. They spoke of stockings, of chocolate, of songs sung across the wire. They remembered that in the darkest winter of the war, their captors had shown them unexpected humanity. But standing in the ruins of their homeland in 1946, those memories felt like ghosts from another world, a reminder that kindness had been found in captivity, while freedom at home meant hunger. And yet, in time, those very memories would help shape how former enemies rebuilt their view of each other, transforming bitterness into something resembling reconciliation. Decades after the war, elderly German veterans would sit in quiet halls, nursing cups of coffee, and speak of memories that had never left them. Many had fought in North Africa or France. Many had marched across dusty roads in defeat. Yet what they remembered most vividly was a Christmas spent behind barbed wire in America. They remembered stockings hung in barracks, pine trees trimmed with scraps of paper, and the astonishing sight of parcels filled with chocolate and cigarettes sent by local church groups. They remembered the sound of Still Nacht, sung by hundreds of German voices, and the moment American guards joined softly with Silent Night. They remembered the shock, the guilt, the gratitude, the feeling that, even in captivity, they had been treated with dignity. One former POW recalled in an interview, "I came home to find my family starving. But I never forgot that one Christmas in America. It was the first time I questioned what we had been told about our enemies His words echoed countless others. For men who had grown up believing the United States was decadent and cruel, the kindness they received in captivity left an indelible mark. Historians later argued that these experiences mattered long after the war ended. When West Germany and the United States forged a close alliance in the early years of the Cold War, the memories of humane treatment in POW camps played their part. Former soldiers, now leaders, businessmen, or fathers, carried with them recollections of Christmas gifts and friendly guards. They knew firsthand that their former enemies had shown mercy when they did not have to. The irony remained powerful. The war had been one of the most brutal in history. Cities burned, millions perished, hatred ran deep, and yet, in the middle of it, ordinary Americans had packed stockings, baked cookies, and sent parcels to men who just months earlier had worn the enemy's uniform. Those small gestures did not end the war, but they planted seeds of memory that outlasted the bombs and the barbed wire. For the POWs themselves, the legacy was deeply personal. Some spoke of how the experience reshaped their faith. Others described how it softened their view of humanity, even after the horrors they had witnessed. A few even returned to America after the war, emigrating to the very country where they had once been imprisoned. Communities, too, remembered. Farmers who had employed German POWs during harvest seasons told stories of young men who worked hard, sang carols, and sometimes carved toys for their children. In small towns across America, families recalled slipping gifts to prisoners at Christmas, never imagining how deeply those gestures would be remembered. The final image is haunting but hopeful. Barbed wire fences dusted with snow, prisoners huddled in barracks, guards stamping their feet against the cold. And then, from the darkness, the rising sound of voices, German and English, enemy and enemy, singing the same hymn. A song of peace carried across the wire, echoing through time. A diary entry from a German prisoner perhaps said it best. I did not know what to expect in America, but on Christmas morning, I unwrapped chocolate and heard our carols sung in the night. I realized then that humanity is stronger than hate. I will never forget it. The story of Christmas behind barbed wire reminds us that wars are fought with weapons, but remembered through human acts. Sometimes the most enduring victories are not won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when enemies choose to see each other as men. And so, long after the tanks and guns fell silent, long after the rubble was cleared from Europe's cities, the memory of those Christmas gifts, simple, humble, and astonishing, endured as proof that even in war, kindness can leave the deepest mark.